Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today, the curious case of the Campden Wonder. On the 16th of August 1660, an approximately 70-year-old William Harrison walked toward the village of Charingworth, about 2 miles from Chipping Campden, with the intention of collecting rent for his employer, the Lady Viscountess Campden. When he failed to return home, Harrison's wife sent out their servant John Perry to find him, but neither man returned that evening. Becoming more alarmed, Harrison's son Edward went looking for his father and Perry the next morning, and finally found John Perry on the road to Charingworth, but the latter explains that he had not found the elder Harrison. The two then set out to Ebrington, where they found the tenants Harrison was to have visited, and learned that Harrison had, in fact, made contact with them, but no sign of him was otherwise found. That is, until William Harrison's blood-stained collar, hat, and comb were found alongside the road. Seemingly, at least partially owing to John Perry inexplicably not returning the night he went out searching for Harrison, suspicion soon fell on him, and rumours started that he had murdered his master. When first interrogated, Perry explained the reason he had not returned that night was because he got lost. You see, when first ordered to go out into the night to search for Harrison, Perry claimed he was too scared to do it, owing to it being completely dark. Thus, after a brief walkabout, he instead went and hid in his master's henhouse. Around midnight, however, the moon came out, providing enough light to search by, but in the process of searching, a mist descended, causing him to get lost. He then went to sleep under a bush for the night and then resumed his search the next day, at which point Edward Harrison found him. He otherwise claimed he had no knowledge of what had happened to the elder Harrison. The magistrate, being unsatisfied with this story, had Perry detained while further investigation could take place. Now, approximately a week later, with little progress in the case, Perry was subjected to additional interrogation. Initially, he stuck to his story, but later he changed his tune. It's important to note here that it may be that subsequent interrogations were of the strong-armed variety, as was very common at the time, or he might have simply been scared that he'd be tried for murder and so wanted to shift the blame to someone else. Well, whatever the case, in the subsequent interrogation, Perry supposedly intimated that a tinker had killed Harrison, and later that he knew a servant of an unnamed gentleman had robbed and murdered Harrison. In yet another interrogation after this, Perry finally cracked, claiming that his mother Joan and brother Richard had waited until Harrison had finished collecting rents and then robbed and killed him, dumping his body in a pond. He even gave a detailed account of the event, including his own involvement in it, telling his brother when to expect Harrison and where. He also stated that after the attack he encountered his mother, brother, and the unconscious Harrison. To quote the confession as recounted by Magistrate Sir Thomas Overbury in his 1676 account of the event, at which he told his brother he hoped he would not kill his master, who replied, "Peace, peace, you're a fool," which, having done, he took a bag of money out of his pocket and threw it into his mother's lap, and then he and his brother carried his master's dead body into the garden adjoining to the congegree, where they consulted what to do with it, and at length agreed to throw it in the Great Sink by Wallington's Mill. He then stated his mother told him to return to his master's house to see if anyone had grown suspicious of Harrison's absence. He later claimed to have taken the bloodied hat, collar, and comb, slashed them with a knife, and then placed them along the road so it would be assumed Harrison had been robbed and murdered there. When brought in for questioning, John and Richard Perry denied the entire story, and although the pond was dredged, no body was found. As Joan and Richard did not have an alibi during the night in question, and Joan Perry seemingly would have no reason to implicate himself in murdering a man, all three Perrys were arrested for the murder of William Harrison. However, owing to the lack of a body or clear evidence that a murder had taken place at all, the presiding judge in the case, Sir Christopher Turner, ultimately refused to prosecute the three for murder. That being said, about a year previous, the Harrison household had been robbed of £140. Given John Perry's assertion that his family had been continually pressuring him to rob the Harrisons, and that they themselves supposedly had the intent to do so, John Perry was questioned about the former robbery. He then affirmed that his brother had committed the robbery, and while John himself wasn't directly involved in the act, he had told his brother where the money was kept. After stealing the money, it was supposedly buried in Perry's garden with the intent of digging it up during the next Feast of Archangels, long after most would have forgotten about the robbery. The timing of this meant that the money should still have been buried in the garden when John Perry was confessing this, but the garden was searched and no money was found. Interestingly, despite the fact that there was no evidence that the Perrys had robbed the Harrisons the year previous other than John Perry's assertion, and despite the fact that Perry's mother and brother denied that they had done any of this, all three pled guilty to the robbery charge. So now the big question is, well, why did they do this? Well, as for John, he had already implicated himself as an accomplice, so it was natural enough that he would then plead guilty. But his mother and brother, well, they were a different matter. They initially pled not guilty, but within minutes of this, they changed their plea to guilty. It appears they were advised to do so, and to ask for a pardon under the Indemnity and Oblivion Act of 1660 as a time-saving measure for the court. In a nutshell, this was an act that gave a general pardon for anyone who had committed a crime during the Civil War, so long as said crime wasn't unlicensed murder, rape, piracy, witchcraft, sodomy, or bestiality. Thanks to this, if the three pled guilty and asked for a pardon, they would not receive any punishment whatsoever, and the court wouldn't have to waste time in attempting to prosecute the case. Thus, they pled guilty and were immediately let go. But this is not really good news, because this act likely cost the three of them their lives. You see, when Harrison still hadn't turned up by the spring of 1661, it was decided that he must have been murdered. Because the three had pled guilty to robbing Harrison previously, Harrison had been known to be carrying a significant amount of rent money on the night in question. At least John Perry had known this fact and the route Harrison would be taking, and Harrison's bloody items had been found. It was decided there was sufficient evidence to try the three for Harrison's murder. Despite proclaiming their innocence, the judge, Sir Robert Hyde, and the jury, well, they didn't buy it. The three were convicted of murder, and they were hanged together in Gloucestershire on Broadway Hill. Now, since Joan had also been suspected of being a witch, she was naturally hanged first in the hopes that any spell on her sons would be lifted by her death, allowing them to confess to the murder. But in all three cases, the trio, including John, professed their innocence right up until the short drop and the sudden stop. John even recanted his former story, saying that he made it up and actually knew nothing of what happened to Harrison. And, well, sadly, as it turns out, they were telling the truth. Approximately 1 year after they were hanged, William Harrison returned to Chipping Campden, alive and well. Alright, so now another question is raised. Well, where the hell was he this whole time? Well, he claimed that he had been robbed and kidnapped by two men on horseback. During the ensuing melee, the elderly man also claims to have been stabbed in the thigh and the side. After this, he states that he was sold for £7 to a group who dealt in human trafficking. He was then placed aboard a ship to presumably be sold into slavery. It was while he was on this ship for 6 weeks, which was a really long time considering it only travelled a short distance, he was nursed back to health. However, en route to whatever the destination, the slave ship was attacked around North Africa by Turkish pirates, who then took Harrison and the rest on board and sold them into slavery. As for Harrison, he claims to have been sold to an elderly doctor in modern-day Izmir in Turkey. His time as an assistant to the doctor, it was cut short, however, after only about a year when his new master died. After this, he claimed that he used a silver bowl his master had given him to gain passage on a Portuguese ship returning home. In Portugal, he encountered a fellow Englishman who took pity on him, providing him money and food for passage back to England. Now, while this sort of kidnapping was not unheard of, it was certainly unusual to kidnap a man who was 70 years old because he wouldn't have much value on the slave market. Certainly, the rent money he was carrying would have been worth the robbery part, but the trouble and additional risk in transporting and selling him to the slaver group wouldn't have been worth the £7 they'd supposedly got for him. Because of this, it's suspected that he might have just skipped town while he was collecting money for his master, and he left his bloodied items behind to make people think that he'd been killed. However, the aforementioned Sir Thomas Overbury notes that this seems unlikely given the elderly Harrison was reasonably well off in his current profession already. Harrison also hadn't taken any of the considerable sum of money that he had himself accumulated over his lifetime. On top of this, he was well respected and had a good reputation around town, including having always seemed happy with his station, even up to his disappearance. Sir Thomas does speculate that perhaps someone hired the supposed kidnappers to attack Harrison and get him out of the way, explaining why such might bother to kidnap such an elderly individual in the first place. Sir Thomas thought the prime suspect in that scenario would perhaps be Harrison's son, hoping to get Harrison's job, even if this is a bit of a stretch given the facts known about the case. Curiously, a couple of weeks before Harrison's disappearance, there is record of John Perry reporting being attacked along the road by two men wielding swords, though he ultimately managed to escape. During his latter interrogation, however, he changed his story and said that he'd made the whole thing up with a mind to use the story to remove suspicion from himself and his family when they would later rob and murder Harrison. Well, whatever really happened, despite Magistrate Sir Thomas Overbury noting that at least some at the time thought Harrison's story far-fetched, there doesn't seem to be any record of anyone interrogating him further about it, and he was also given his old job back, and he resumed his duties. As you might expect, the fact that 3 people had been executed for the murder of William Harrison when in fact he hadn't been murdered at all led to a bit of a public outcry. It's often said that as a result of this injustice, the English courts instituted a new criminal rule which said, "No body, no murder." This is a law that supposedly stayed in place for some 3 centuries after finally being rescinded during the 20th century. However, for what it's worth, we could find no such record of any specific no body, no murder law being instituted, and there are certainly plenty of cases of people being convicted of murder in England in the interim when no body was ever found. Any such law would have created a huge loophole to relatively easily get away with murder. You'd just need to be really good at hiding the remains, which wouldn't have been difficult. For example, for a time, things like medical schools and the like would not only pay you for said body with no questions asked, but generally keep quiet about everything and then dispose of the body in a way where the remains wouldn't be identifiable. This was actually the impetus for the infamous Burke and Hare murders that occurred in Scotland during the 19th century. That said, corpus delicti did exist, which is a similar concept to this no body, no murder idea, but in this case, a physical body is not actually required. You just need sufficient evidence that a murder occurred, which may include an actual body, but could also simply be testimonial evidence. Essentially, you just needed a body of evidence to show a murder had taken place, rather than an actual physical body being required, which is perhaps where the aforementioned apparent no body, no murder misconception comes from. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode. Please do hit that like button below and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos every day of the week. Also, these videos, they're totally made possible because of our patrons. You can support us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut. Today I'd like to particularly thank Ken Snyder for his generous donation. It really makes a difference to making these videos possible. So thank you to Ken and all of our patrons for the support, and thank you for watching.